Some called it the House of Hope. Others whispered its name like a prayer. But for at least two families in Fairhaven, Ohio, Dr. Harold Whitman's fertility clinic would soon be known by another name, the place where God forgot to look. On the east side of Fairhaven, tucked neatly between a Methodist church and an old brick library, stood a two-story white building with blue shutters and a modest gold plaque. Whitman Fertility Center. Since 2009, there was nothing outwardly remarkable about the place. No billboard, no aggressive advertising. The lawn was trimmed with quiet care, and the white hydrangeas at the entrance seemed to bloom all year. But to the townspeople of Fairhaven and to hundreds of desperate couples from neighboring counties, it wasn't just a clinic, it was a sanctuary. Inside, the waiting room was painted a warm cream, decorated not with sterile medical posters, but with framed photos of babies, hundreds of them, newborns wrapped in pastel blankets, toddlers with cake-covered faces, families holding their miracle children in their arms, smiling through tears. In the corner, a bulletin board overflowed with handwritten thank you notes. Some were scrawled in colorful marker, others typed neatly on monogram stationery. But they all had one name in common: Dr. Harold Whitman. He was always referred to by full title, as if anything less would diminish the reverence. At 54, Dr. Whitman had the composed aura of someone who had stood face to face with tragedy and learned to speak softly in its presence. Silver streaked his temples just enough to be dignified. His wire-rimmed glasses perched on a prominent, thoughtful nose. He wore navy suits under his lab coat and carried a leather-bound notebook that no one had ever seen him open. To his patients, he was more than a physician. He was a last hope. Most couples arrived at his clinic after a long trail of disappointment, failed IVF cycles, miscarriages, unexplained infertility. For them, Dr. Whitman represented something modern medicine had all but abandoned: belief. Not just in science, but in something greater, something almost divine. And Dr. Whitman embraced the role. Without ever declaring it aloud, he cultivated an image somewhere between healer and holy man. He never promised success, only faith in possibility. But the success came anyway. Over 300 babies had been born to former patients in just under a decade. The numbers defied statistics. The whispers grew louder. People said he had the touch. For those who worked under him, Dr. Whitman was enigmatic but exacting. His staff was small: 2 nurses, 1 receptionist, and a part-time lab technician. He kept his records old-fashioned, handwritten, and meticulously stored in locked cabinets. When questioned, he insisted it was more personal, more human, less vulnerable to hackers. No one questioned him. The medical community, initially skeptical, eventually relented. Articles were published, awards followed. The Fairhaven Chronicle ran a cover story titled "The Man Who Made Miracles." And no one, not even the journalists, noticed how every single couple featured in the article had one very specific thing in common. The wife was under 30. The husband was always asked to wait outside. And the success rate was 100%. Of course, that detail was never spoken aloud. In a town like Fairhaven, you didn't look too hard at miracles. You said thank you, paid the bill, and joined the wall of smiling faces. That is, until the day Daniel Walker walked into the clinic with hope in his eyes and walked out 9 months later with something else entirely growing in the back of his mind. A question he didn't know he'd one day risk everything to answer. Daniel Walker had never considered himself a desperate man. At 32, he lived life by the numbers his ledger always balanced. His calendar color-coded, his oil changed every 3,000 miles. As a mechanical engineer, he trusted in systems, in logic, in the comfort of torque specs and fail-safes, but infertility had a way of making even the most rational man feel like he was losing control. Emily, his wife, was his opposite in many ways. 26, with soft hazel eyes and a voice made for bedtime stories, she taught kindergarten at Madison Elementary and kept a journal filled with baby names. She believed in vision boards and lavender oil. She prayed quietly at night. She still called her mother every Sunday. They had been trying for nearly 3 years. At first, it was a quiet hope: ovulation trackers, prenatal vitamins, date night optimism. Then came the doctors, the tests, The months that ended in late-night tears and silent breakfasts. Every blood panel came back normal. No endometriosis, no hormonal imbalances, no low motility, just a sterile phrase on every report. Unexplained infertility. It was Emily's sister who brought up Dr. Harold Whitman. They had been at a 4th of July barbecue when Rachel leaned in and said, "I know someone. He helped my friend Jenna after 5 years of nothing. Now she has twins. I swear to God, he's some kind of miracle worker." Daniel scoffed at the word miracle, but Emily clung to it like a lifeline. That night, she looked him in the eyes and said, "Just one more try, please." Daniel made the call the next morning. The first appointment felt different from the sterile consultations they were used to. Dr. Whitman greeted them in the waiting room himself, smiling gently and shaking their hands like they were old friends. He spoke slowly, listened intently, took notes in a worn leather notebook. "It's not uncommon," he said, eyes flicking between them. "Modern lifestyles, stress levels, even subconscious blocks. All of these can interfere with conception in ways science still struggles to measure. But I've had remarkable success treating cases just like yours." He explained his approach, a multi-phase protocol focused on hormonal alignment and uterine receptivity. One particular procedure, he said, involved a brief sedation and direct hormonal modulation. It sounded clinical, but his tone was reassuring, almost fatherly. "For optimal conditions," he added, "I ask that only the patient be present during the procedure. Privacy and total relaxation are key." Daniel hesitated just a flicker, but Emily squeezed his hand. "It's okay," she whispered. "Let's trust him." They scheduled the procedure for the following Thursday. That morning, Daniel kissed Emily's forehead and watched a nurse in pale blue scrubs lead her down a quiet hallway. He returned to the waiting room, picked up a magazine he didn't read, and tried not to check the clock every 30 seconds. When Emily reemerged 40 minutes later, she looked dazed but smiling. "Just groggy," she said, leaning into him. "Like after dental surgery." Dr. Whitman assured them the session went smoothly. "We've created the right environment," he said. "Now, we wait." 2 months later, they heard the words they'd been longing for. Emily stood in the kitchen, pregnancy test trembling in hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Daniel, it's positive." The next 9 months were a blur of doctor visits, baby showers, and cautious elation. They decorated the nursery in sage green, chose the name Liam. When the boy was born a perfect 7 pounds, 10 ounces, Daniel wept for the first time in years. But joy has a strange way of fading into silence. By Liam's 2nd birthday, Daniel began to notice things. His son's eyes were a startling shade of green, something neither side of the family carried. His cheekbones sharp, jaw narrow, his skin paler than either parent's. Friends would joke, "Looks nothing like Dad, huh?" And each time, something in Daniel's chest tightened. At first, he brushed it off. Genes were messy. Grandparents skipped generations. But the doubt, it grew roots. He caught himself studying Liam's face in the mirror, tilting his head like an investigator matching a composite sketch. The child was bright, loving, beautiful. But Daniel couldn't stop hearing one small question, growing louder with each passing day. What if he isn't mine? Daniel Walker never meant to become a stranger in his own home. But that's what suspicion does. It sits in the corner of a room like a silent guest, never touching anything, never speaking, but somehow always there looming. Watching. Waiting. It began subtly. A passing comment at a neighborhood barbecue. "Liam's got those Irish eyes, huh? Where'd he get those from?" Daniel laughed along, but his fingers clenched just a bit tighter around his plastic cup. Then came another, this time from his own father. "Your kid's gonna break hearts. That green-eyed charm's lethal. You sure he's yours?" said in jest. But it hit like a slap. He'd never questioned Emily before. Not once. She was loyal to a fault, allergic to lies, someone who cried during cereal commercials. But now, every moment of intimacy they'd ever shared played back in his mind like corrupted film, grainy, flickering, incomplete. The thing about Liam wasn't just his eyes. It was everything. He had a refined symmetry to his face, a sharp chin, the kind of features you see in magazine ads or college brochures, not the kind passed down by steel-jawed Midwestern mechanics. His skin was porcelain smooth, his fingers long, his expressions oddly adult. Even at 2, he had a seriousness, an eerie focus. When Daniel watched him color or stack blocks, it didn't feel like watching a child. It felt like watching someone study the world. And then one morning, Daniel caught his own reflection next to Liam's in the hallway mirror. There was no resemblance. None. It was as if the boy had come from a different blueprint entirely. Daniel's hands began shaking. That same afternoon, while Liam napped on the couch, Daniel crept over with a tissue in hand and gently plucked a few strands of hair from the boy's head. Liam stirred but didn't wake. Daniel kissed his forehead, whispering an apology he wasn't sure he meant. Later that night, he clipped a piece of his own fingernail, sealed both samples in a sandwich bag, and searched online for discreet DNA testing services. He found one just outside Columbus, reputable, private, fast turnaround. He told Emily he had a conference to attend. 3 days. She kissed him goodbye, slipped a protein bar into his backpack and said, "Drive safe." The drive to Columbus felt longer than it should have. He kept glancing at the bag inside his glove compartment like it might explode. He turned the radio up, then off, then on again. Every commercial about parenting or family vacations felt like an attack. The clinic was inside a medical park, quiet and cold, the kind of place where people came to confirm suspicions they hoped were wrong. He handed the samples over in a nondescript envelope, filled out the form with trembling hands, and paid extra for priority processing. The next 4 days were hell. At night, he stared at the ceiling, replaying Liam's first steps. His first words, the time he said, "da-da," with arms outstretched. Could it be fake? Could biology erase 2 years of love? He didn't know. When the envelope finally arrived, it was slim, clean, clinical. His name printed in a small font in the upper left. He opened it with a utility knife, fingers numb. The document inside was short, 1 page. Technical jargon, locus numbers, allele matches. He scanned, searching for the only sentence that mattered. There it was. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. The room tilted. The air felt thick. Daniel stared at the words for what felt like hours. His heart was pounding, but his mind had gone blank. No rage, no clarity, just the crushing silence of a foundation giving way. He read the sentence again and again and again. But it didn't change. The boy he'd raised, kissed, fed, bathed, laughed with, was not his son. And somewhere buried beneath the numbness was a truth even more terrifying than betrayal. It wasn't Emily. It couldn't be. There was no other man. There never had been. But there had been one man in that room the day of the procedure. One man who had asked Daniel to wait outside. One man who'd smiled as if he held the key to creation itself. And for the first time, Daniel saw him not as a doctor, but as something else entirely. Daniel didn't go home that night. He sat in his truck outside a rest stop off I-71, the DNA report folded and refolded a dozen times, edges soft like worn cotton. The parking lot buzzed with halogen lights and the hum of vending machines, but his world was silent, still. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Liam. That tiny hand gripping his finger for the first time. The way he'd giggle uncontrollably at the word banana, the night he'd crawled into bed after a nightmare, pressed his head to Daniel's chest and whispered, "Daddy's safe." Now Daniel wasn't sure who needed protecting from whom. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. And when he pulled into the driveway at dawn the next morning, the house looked unfamiliar, like a photograph taken by someone else. Emily was in the kitchen, making scrambled eggs, wearing that oversized Ohio State hoodie he loved on her. "Hey," she smiled. "You're home early." He didn't answer. Just walked to the counter, dropped the envelope, and watched the blood drain from her face as she opened it. At first, nothing. Then her knees buckled, and she sat hard on the kitchen floor. "Emily," he said, "tell me the truth." Her lips trembled. I don't understand." He knelt beside her. "It says I'm not his father, so unless there's a massive error, there's only 2 possibilities. Either you cheated on me," his voice cracked, "or something else happened. Something you're not telling me." She stared at him, eyes wide with something beyond fear. It was confusion. Real, Raw confusion. I didn't. I swear to God, Daniel, I've never been with anyone else. Ever. You're the only one. The only one. He believed her. And that terrified him more than anything. Because if Emily was telling the truth, and every cell in his body screamed she was, then the only other person present during the conception procedure was Dr. Harold Whitman. Daniel stood, dizzy. You remember anything? Anything unusual that day? Emily wiped her face. Her voice was a whisper. I remember being cold. The room was cold. And I remember the injection. The nurse gave it to me, then left. I was alone. With him? She hesitated. I don't remember him coming in, but I wasn't fully out either. It was like I was floating, like I was underwater, and someone was above me, moving. Shadows. Hands. I don't know. I thought it was part of the procedure. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned away, tried to steady himself against the sink. Was that what Whitman had counted on? The fog of mild sedation, the vulnerability of trust? Emily looked up at him, her face ashen. Daniel, do you think he... She couldn't finish. I don't know, he said quietly, but I'm going to find out. That afternoon, Daniel drove to the Fairhaven Police Department. The woman at the front desk took one look at the paper in his hand and called a detective. Detective Sarah DeWitt had been with Fairhaven PD for 11 years. She'd seen a lot runaways, domestic abuse, elder fraud, but never anything quite like this. She read the report, listened to Daniel's story. Then she leaned back and exhaled. You're saying you believe this doctor may have impregnated your wife without consent? Daniel nodded. I know how it sounds, but I've done the math. The dates match, and she swears there was no one else. He was alone with her while she was under. DeWitt didn't laugh, didn't dismiss him. She took notes. If what you're saying is true, she said, it would constitute medical sexual assault. But we're going to need more than a DNA test to pursue criminal charges. Do you still have the envelope? Daniel handed it to her. She placed it in a plastic evidence bag, labeled it carefully. I'll file this as a formal complaint, but to move forward, we'll need corroboration. Witnesses, patterns, a reason to dig deeper. Daniel met her eyes. What if there are others? DeWitt didn't answer right away. Then she said, if there are, we'll find them. But in her gut, she already knew. Doctors like Harold Whitman didn't just do this once. The complaint landed on Special Agent Dana Ramirez's desk on a rainy Thursday morning, sandwiched between a pharmaceutical fraud report and a domestic terrorism alert from West Virginia. It stood out for all the wrong reasons. A DNA mismatch, a fertility doctor, an alleged unauthorized conception during sedation. Ramirez blinked twice, reread the summary, then pushed her chair back and muttered, what the hell is this? She wasn't new to unusual cases. 15 years with the FBI's Crimes Against Persons unit had thrown her into some of the darkest corners of humanity. But this was different. It wasn't just disturbing, it was structurally insidious, a predator cloaked in lab coats and sterilized ethics. She called Fairhaven PD and requested the original evidence files. Within an hour, a courier dropped off a small folder marked Case 114, Omega. Inside, the DNA results of Daniel Walker and his son, a sworn affidavit from Daniel, notes from Detective Sarah DeWitt, and an audio clip of Emily Walker describing the fog of sedation. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough for a shadow of smoke, and Dana Ramirez had learned long ago. Where there's smoke in medicine, there's usually fire covered in latex gloves. That afternoon, she drove to Fairhaven, a modest town with old money churches and fresh paint storefronts. The Whitman Fertility Center sat as described: quaint, sterile, beloved. Too clean, too perfect. Ramirez didn't go in. Instead, she visited the local health department and subpoenaed public records. Dr. Harold Whitman, born 1969, board-certified reproductive endocrinologist, graduated top of his class at Dartmouth, completed residency at Johns Hopkins. No complaints, no lawsuits, not even a parking ticket. But one thing caught her eye. Between 2015 and 2023, The clinic reported over 300 successful conceptions. That wasn't illegal. But for a private clinic with a two-person nursing staff and no in-house IVF lab, it was improbable. Ramirez made a call to Quantico and requested a preliminary pattern analysis. She needed names, dates, patient demographics. By Monday, a team of analysts had cross-referenced public birth records with patients known to have visited Whitman's clinic. What they found made her stomach tighten. Out of 312 successful pregnancies linked to the clinic over the past 8 years, 91 involved women under the age of 30 who had undergone hormonal balancing procedures. Of those 91, 88 had spouses or partners listed as genetically unrelated to the child in post-conception DNA tests. Most quietly, some confidentially settled in family court. None had ever filed criminal complaints. It wasn't a red flag. It was a goddamn crimson curtain. Ramirez didn't sleep that night. By the end of the week, the FBI opened a covert task force under her command, Operation God's Seed. 3 units. 1 mission: to expose a potential pattern of systematic reproductive abuse. Unit 1. Financial and Pharmaceutical Forensics, led by Agent Rick Tran, a no-nonsense numbers guy with a nose for ghost orders and under-the-table inventory. He began pulling purchase orders from the clinic's medical suppliers. One drug stood out, propofol, a powerful sedative, nicknamed Milk of Amnesia. In 3 years, Whitman had ordered enough to put an elephant farm to sleep. Unit 2. Patient Outreach, quietly contacting former female patients who fit the under 30 profile. They weren't told the full scope, just that there was a federal health audit. Most were cooperative. Many recalled foggy memories of their procedure. Several admitted they were asked to come alone. None questioned it at the time. One woman said something that froze Ramirez mid-note. It felt almost spiritual. Like, he was transferring energy into me. Unit 3. Undercover Infiltration. An agent named Claire Halston, age 29, was chosen to pose as a new patient. Her cover? Recently married, struggling with infertility, seeking natural conception before trying IVF. Claire was briefed, trained in protocol, and prepped with a fabricated medical history designed to attract Whitman's signature recommendation. On Tuesday morning, Claire walked into Whitman Fertility Center wearing a floral dress and a nervous smile. The receptionist greeted her warmly. "First time here?" Claire nodded. "Yeah. My OB recommended Dr. Whitman. Said he works miracles." The receptionist beamed. "He really does." Claire was ushered into a softly lit exam room. 10 minutes later, Dr. Harold Whitman entered. He looked exactly like the photos. Tall, lean, silver-streaked hair, eyes that held just a little too long on her face. He smiled gently. "Claire, let's talk about creating life." Claire swallowed hard. The game had begun. Claire Halston had been undercover before drug mules. Ponzi schemes, a cult that worshipped microwave frequencies, but nothing quite like this. Nothing that demanded she weaponize vulnerability. In Operation Godseed, she wasn't a cop. She was a woman named Claire Morton, 29, married 3 years, unable to conceive. She was hopeful, she was exhausted, she was fragile, and she needed a miracle. And Dr. Harold Whitman was going to offer one. Their first meeting lasted 40 minutes. Claire played her part to perfection, gentle smiles, trembling hands, calculated hesitations. Whitman responded like script. Warm, assured, reverent even. He reviewed her fabricated records, nodded thoughtfully, then said something chilling in his familiarity. "With your age and profile, Claire, you're an excellent candidate for my hormonal alignment protocol. It's helped many women just like you." He paused. "There is a step in the process, one that requires temporary sedation. Nothing invasive, just a soft reset to optimize uterine receptivity. You'll be in good hands." She smiled nervously. "Will my husband be allowed in the room?" Whitman shook his head gently, almost paternally. "It's best if you're alone. The body responds best when it's not being watched." Claire logged that phrase mentally, heart pounding under her calm expression. Not being watched. She left with a follow-up appointment set for Friday at 9 a.m. Back in the safe house, Ramirez and the team reviewed the recording. "He's done this before," Agent Trans said. "Too rehearsed. He's got the script memorized." Ramirez pointed to the timeline. "Friday's the window. If he repeats the same behavior under sedation conditions, we move." They prepped the sting. Claire would wear a subdermal mic under her collarbone and a micro pinhole camera inside her blouse button, high resolution, heat sensitive, no blink indicators. A separate transmitter would be embedded inside her bra strap to activate the emergency beacon if she tapped it 3 times. 4 agents would be staged in an unmarked van across the street. A mobile warrant sat pre-signed with a federal magistrate, contingent upon audio-visual proof of misconduct. The mission briefing ended in silence. "This is delicate," Ramirez said quietly. "He doesn't break laws the usual way. This isn't a drug drop. It's a surgical crime. Be ready for nothing to happen, and ready to act if everything does." Friday, 8:52 a.m. Claire sat in the reception area, palms sweating despite her practice calm. She wore a simple cardigan over a sundress, hair down, minimal makeup. Innocent, approachable, fertile, Dr. Whitman emerged from the hallway. "Good morning, Claire," she smiled. "Hi, doctor." He led her to the procedure room, cream walls, dim lighting, a faint scent of eucalyptus. The table was already prepped. "You'll feel a light pinch," he said, injecting the propofol. "Then you'll just drift. Nothing to fear." Claire laid back, heart slamming against her ribs. She let her body go limp. Her breath slowed. Her eyelids fluttered, half closed. From the camera's perspective, she appeared sedated. Inside, her mind was electric. Through the micro audio, Ramirez heard it all from the van. Chair scraping. The nurse's voice. "I'll give you 2 privacy." The door closing. Silence. Then Whitman's voice, low and murmuring. "Not clinical. Not professional. So quiet. So ready." Claire heard fabric shifting. Gloves. A drawer. A zipper. Her finger moved slowly, barely perceptible 3 taps to her left hip. In the van, the signal blinked. "Go," Ramirez ordered. Agents burst from the vehicle and stormed through the clinic entrance with practiced precision. The receptionist barely registered their badges before 2 agents cleared the hallway, weapons holstered but visible. Ramirez herself pushed into the procedure room. Dr. Whitman stood beside Claire, one hand still gloved, the other holding a vial of clear liquid. He turned, surprised but not panicked. "Agent Ramirez, FBI," she said, voice cold. "Step away from the patient now." His expression hardened, just for a second. Then he smiled. "You're making a mistake." "You've already made it," she replied, holding up a tablet displaying live video feed from Claire's camera. "We've been watching the whole time." He glanced at Claire's face. She opened her eyes fully now, alert, unwavering. "You're under arrest, Dr. Whitman," Ramirez said, "for suspected sexual assault under medical sedation, unlawful use of controlled substances, and violation of bodily autonomy." Still, he didn't resist. He simply placed the vial on the counter and extended his wrists. "You don't understand," he said quietly, almost with pity. "I've given these families what they prayed for." "No," Ramirez replied, snapping the cuffs shut. "You gave them yourself." As he was led out through the front doors, cameras caught the moment press already swarming from the tip someone had leaked anonymously. And in the back room, Claire exhaled for the first time in 15 minutes, staring at the spot where the man had just stood. The sting had worked, but the real investigation had just begun. The search warrant allowed for full seizure of property, both physical and digital. While the media frenzy exploded outside, inside the Whitman Fertility Center, every hard drive, tablet, and personal laptop was carefully cataloged, bagged, and sent to the FBI's cyber forensics unit in Cleveland. But it was the desktop computer in Dr. Whitman's private office, a sleek, custom-built tower hidden behind a faux cabinet, that drew the most attention. The machine was encrypted, deeply. A multi-layered defense shell built like a Russian nesting doll of access keys. No cloud sync, no remote backups. Whatever was on this drive, Whitman had gone to great lengths to hide it. It took 4 days for the forensics team to breach the second firewall. On the 5th day, Special Agent Ramirez got the call from Agent Lyle Monroe, lead cyber analyst. "We cracked it," he said, breathless. "You need to see this. Now." She drove straight to the lab. Monroe met her at the door, holding a folder. "We found a directory buried under 3 decoy partitions." He called it patient optimization logs. Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "Clinical notes?" Monroe hesitated. "Not exactly." He pulled up a monitor and clicked through a list of file names, codes, initials, dates. Some folders were labeled HO12, HO33, HO48. Inside each folder, photographs, video files, scanned intake forms, and one shared spreadsheet. It was titled Genesis Protocol, Active Monitoring Spreadsheet. Ramirez leaned in as Monroe opened the document. Rows and rows of entries, patient initials, ages, sedation dates, follow-up outcomes. Then columns with bizarre titles, receptivity rating, genetic match potential, and one labeled simply implantation source. Many entries in the last column read, donor, HW. Ramirez froze. HW, that's Harold Whitman, Monroe confirmed. He was using his own sperm. Repeatedly. For years. Without consent. Without disclosure. To implant patients who believed they were undergoing hormonal stimulation. "And the videos?" she asked. Monroe's jaw tightened. "We're still reviewing them. Some are surveillance footage, some are worse. One was recorded with a head-mounted camera, dated August 2021. The audio logs have him saying things like, 'Perfection begins with correction, and these children will redefine humanity.'" Ramirez's stomach turned. It wasn't just abuse. It was doctrine. That evening, Ramirez returned to the Fairhaven field office and pulled up Daniel Walker's original file. She flipped to the page with Liam's conception date. It matched perfectly with one of the spreadsheet entries. HO 33 vertical bar, F 26 vertical bar sedation, the 19th of June 2021 vertical bar, outcome. Successful vertical bar, implantation source, donor, HW, and beneath it, in the notes field, high genetic viability, exceptional cranial symmetry, recommend close monitoring. Daniel hadn't just imagined the difference in Liam. Whitman had documented it. With the digital evidence secured, Ramirez contacted the Department of Justice to escalate the charges. The FBI's Victim Assistance Program prepared to begin outreach to every woman whose file appeared in the spreadsheet, 86 in total. Some had twins, some had sons or daughters approaching school age, some had no idea their pregnancies had resulted from artificial insemination at all. They were told it was hormonal balancing, not conception. And none of them had given informed consent. In an interrogation room lit by pale fluorescence, Harold Whitman sat in silence. His attorney had advised him to say nothing, but after 30 hours in isolation, he asked to speak with Ramirez. She entered the room, voice neutral. "You understand your rights?" Whitman nodded. "I'd like to understand your motive," Ramirez said. "You were respected, trusted. You could have run a legitimate donor program." Whitman smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't understand. These weren't crimes. They were corrections." "Corrections?" she asked. He leaned forward. "The human genome is broken, degraded, polluted by laziness, disease, weak traits. I fixed that. I selected for strength, intelligence, purity." Ramirez stared. "You're not God, Dr. Whitman." He shrugged. "God left the room a long time ago." Silence followed. Then he added, almost wistfully, "They'll thank me one day when their children grow up and change the world." Ramirez stood. "Number. They'll spend their lives trying to understand why someone like you was allowed to touch it." She walked out, leaving him in the cold echo of his own madness. The next morning, the press released the story nationwide. Doctor used own DNA in hundreds of fertility procedures without consent. The term medical sexual assault began trending within the hour. And across the country, mothers stared at their children with horror and heartbreak, wondering whose eyes stared back at them. By the time the story hit national news, the FBI hotline had received over 300 calls in 48 hours. Some were curious, others angry. A few were confused, asking if they'd seen something like this on Netflix. But scattered among the noise were women, real voices, trembling but resolute, wondering if their miracle babies had been engineered without their consent. Agent Dana Ramirez and her team worked around the clock to filter the chaos. Most callers didn't qualify under the original Genesis protocol profile either. They had undergone standard IVF with known donor samples or had not received the sedation procedure described. But one call stood out. Her name was Megan Sullivan, 27 years old, from Centerville, just 2 hours south of Fairhaven. 2 years prior, she and her husband had driven to the Whitman Fertility Center after 3 years of unexplained infertility. She remembered the exact phrasing Dr. Whitman used: "You're a textbook candidate for hormonal reset therapy." She'd undergone the procedure in late May 2021. 2 months later, she was pregnant. Her son, Noah, had just turned 2. Megan didn't call to accuse. She called because she couldn't silence a voice in her gut anymore. "My husband, he said things before," she told Ramirez. "He jokes that Noah's too perfect, that he doesn't look like either of us. We thought it was just genetics being weird. But now?" Ramirez scheduled an in-person meeting immediately. Megan and her husband, Colin, arrived at the FBI office 2 days later, bringing with them a copy of their son's birth certificate, family photos, and a Ziploc bag containing strands of Noah's hair. They signed the consent forms, hands shaking. "We're not looking to destroy our lives," Colin said, "but if something's wrong, we'd rather face it than live in denial." The samples were rushed to the Bureau's DNA lab. The results returned in 4 days. Probability of paternity: 0.00%. Ramirez exhaled slowly as the report printed. The air in the office grew heavier with each click of the printer. Case 114 Omega had its second confirmed victim. She pulled up the Genesis protocol spreadsheet from Whitman's decrypted files. There it was: HO 47 vertical bar, F 25 vertical bar, sedation the 28th of May, 2021 vertical bar, outcome, successful vertical bar, implantation source. Donor, HW, notes field, excellent maternal compliance, high phenotypic compatibility, recommend retention. Retention. As if they were livestock. Ramirez closed the file and picked up the phone. With 2 confirmed matches and direct digital documentation to pair, she called the DOJ with a simple sentence: "We have pattern, we have proof, and we have parents willing to testify." The wheels of federal prosecution moved fast after that. Meanwhile, Megan and Colin sat in their living room, holding Noah between them. The boy giggled, playing with a plush elephant, unaware of the storm outside. "He's still our son," Megan whispered. "No matter what." But Colin couldn't stop staring at the child's green-flecked eyes, eyes that did not belong to anyone in his family tree. "What happens when he's old enough to ask?" Colin said quietly. "What do we tell him?" Megan didn't answer. Across the state, other families faced the same question, and soon, many more would. With 2 admissible DNA mismatches, tied to internal logs and Whitman's own recorded files, the prosecution had what they needed: a case beyond reasonable doubt. But Ramirez wasn't done. She ordered a sweep of archived security footage from the clinic's prior years. Most had been overwritten, but one fragment survived, dated July 2019, showing Whitman entering the sedation room alone and locking the door behind him. The chain was complete: consent under false pretenses, unauthorized insemination using his own genetic material, tampering with patient records, audio-visual documentation of patterns and behaviors, 2 matching paternity exclusions. The case became a model of modern medical violation, a precedent-setting prosecution for sexual assault under sedation and fertility fraud. It didn't just shake the local community, it forced the nation to look inward. Talk shows debated the limits of medical trust. Legislators drafted bills redefining informed consent in reproductive procedures. Religious leaders called it bioethical perversion, and psychologists warned of the coming identity crisis among children born from betrayal. But amid the national debate, Megan and Daniel, the first 2 victims to speak publicly, did something braver than anyone expected. They testified. At the preliminary hearing, Megan stood with her hands clasped, voice firm. I wanted a child more than anything, she told the courtroom, but I never asked for his. I never agreed to carry a man's legacy built on deception, and I will not raise my son in the shadow of someone else's obsession. Daniel followed. His words cut deep. I look at my son, and I still see love. But now I also see theft. He was stolen not from a hospital, but from biology, and I will fight to make sure no one else is violated like this again. The courtroom was silent. Even Whitman didn't speak. For the first time, his gaze dropped to the floor. When the U.S. Marshals arrived at the county detention center with the federal arrest warrant in hand, Harold Whitman didn't flinch. He adjusted his cuffs neatly over his wrists, as if heading to a board meeting rather than a federal indictment. His hair was combed, his shoes shined. He offered no resistance, only a soft chuckle. They're finally ready, he said to the guard escorting him. Took them long enough. Inside the black SUV, as it pulled away from the facility, Whitman gazed out the window at the gray Ohio landscape. I thought justice would look different, he mused. Agent Ramirez, seated beside him in the back, didn't respond. She stared ahead, jaw set. Whitman turned to her, a smile playing on his lips. You think I'm evil. You see a monster. But you haven't even asked me why. I've seen your files, Ramirez said. I know your why. He leaned in. Then you don't understand it. She didn't blink. Try me. The interrogation room was cold and silent, outfitted with nothing more than a table, 2 chairs, and a camera bolted to the ceiling. Whitman sat across from Ramirez, hands folded like a priest preparing to give confession. He started slowly. It began with observation. Years of studying fertility patterns, embryo morphology, gene expression. I realized something most doctors ignore. Nature isn't neutral. It selects, it eliminates. But modern medicine interferes. We preserve what was meant to be culled. Ramirez raised an eyebrow. So you decided to play nature? No, he said almost tenderly. I decided to guide it. He described the first adjustment like a scientific breakthrough. The patient was 23. The husband had low motility. They would have failed IVF 5 times, Whitman said. And the child they never would have had now thrives. Strong bones, accelerated language acquisition. I gave them a future. You gave them a lie. I gave them perfection. Ramirez pulled out a printed page, the Genesis spreadsheet. She tapped the column labeled Implantation Source, HW. This wasn't medicine. This was a breeding program. End. Whitman's eyes lit up. You're starting to see it. She leaned in. Did you rape these women? His jaw tightened. I did not violate them. I elevated them. They were sedated, yes, but the procedure itself was non-invasive. I introduced new life through controlled deposition. No pain, no memory, only results. That's not consent. He smirked. Consent is a legal construct. Nature doesn't ask permission. Silence crackled between them like static. Ramirez stood, voice calm but firm. You're not a god, Whitman. You're a fraud with a syringe and a god complex. He didn't flinch. They'll thank me, he whispered. Maybe not today. Maybe not even in 10 years. But when those children grow up smarter, faster, stronger, they'll know who made them. She stared. You think they'll worship you? I think, he said, eyes gleaming, they'll replace the ones who came before. As the confession ended, the Department of Justice filed 27 formal charges against Whitman, including aggravated sexual assault under sedation, medical fraud, unauthorized use of genetic material, tampering with medical records, and violations of federal informed consent statutes. The press dubbed it the Genesis Scandal. Pundits argued on live television. Was it rape? Was it medical malpractice? Was it eugenics? But for the victims, the debate was irrelevant. It was betrayal. It was theft. It was trauma dressed in surgical scrubs. At the arraignment hearing in the Southern District of Ohio, Whitman appeared in a gray suit instead of prison orange. His lawyers requested professional attire to maintain psychological neutrality. The courtroom was packed with victims, reporters, and legal scholars. Judge Marissa Oakley read each charge aloud. When asked how he pleaded, Whitman spoke slowly. Not guilty. I acted in the best interest of the future. A murmur spread across the room. One woman gasped aloud. Ramirez, seated in the front row, didn't react. Her eyes remained fixed on Whitman's hands, still folded neatly, still too steady. Outside, the courthouse steps were overrun with cameras. Behind barricades, protesters held signs that read, "No consent equals crime. Trust betrayed. My child is not your legacy." Inside, the case moved toward trial. Back at headquarters, Ramirez opened the Genesis files one last time. She clicked into the final column. It wasn't labeled like the others. Just a single letter, R. Inside the R column were selective notes, some crossed out, some circled. One entry chilled her. HO 89 vertical bar, implanted the 22nd of December 2022 vertical bar, retained for second-generation observation. Potential breeding candidate. He hadn't planned to stop. He'd planned to scale. As she closed the laptop, Ramirez thought not of Whitman, but of the children. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Growing up with eyes like his, mannerisms like his, unknown truths in their DNA, they had no idea. And soon, they would begin to ask questions. The morning after Harold Whitman's arraignment, the cover of USA Today ran a headline in bold, white block letters. "The doctor who played God." Beneath it, a photo of him being escorted out of the courthouse, eyes forward, face devoid of shame. Behind him, blurred in the chaos, was a woman holding her child tightly, lips pressed to the top of his head like a shield. The shock spread fast. Within 72 hours, over a dozen civil suits were filed across Ohio. By the end of the week, they came from Pennsylvania, Indiana, Michigan, and even as far as Texas families who had once traveled across states to see the miracle worker of Fairhaven. All of them were asking the same question: who fathered my child? The FBI's Victim Assistance Program was overwhelmed. An emergency task force was established to provide trauma counseling, legal guidance, and DNA testing for every former patient of the Whitman Fertility Center. Some women refused to believe it. Others couldn't stop shaking. One mother, interviewed on 60 Minutes, clutched a photograph of her 4-year-old daughter and sobbed, "He didn't just violate me, he rewrote my child's future without my consent." Across talk shows and think pieces, America found itself torn between horror and confusion. Medical experts argued about classifications. Ethicists debated whether Whitman's actions constituted a new form of reproductive assault or a grotesque extension of scientific ambition. But survivors didn't care about labels. They cared about truth, about healing, about the irreversible. In classrooms across the country, health teachers began reworking lessons on consent. In churches, sermons were delivered about trust, power, and the dangers of misplaced faith. In state capitals, lawmakers drafted emergency legislation proposing criminal statutes for unauthorized genetic use and mandatory third-party oversight in fertility clinics. One bill, introduced in the Ohio Senate, was named the Liam and Noah Protection Act, honoring the first 2 confirmed children born from Whitman's unauthorized insemination. The bill called for mandatory DNA documentation of donor material, real-time surveillance during reproductive procedure, lifetime bans on fertility specialists found guilty of misconduct, federal recognition of medical paternity fraud as a sex crime. It passed unanimously, but for families like the Walkers and the Sullivans, policy wasn't enough. Daniel Walker sat in his son Liam's bedroom one night, watching him sleep under glow in the dark stars they'd stuck to the ceiling together. He loved the boy. That never changed. But the love now came with a dull, permanent ache, like loving a memory while carrying a scar. Emily still struggled to look Daniel in the eye sometimes. The guilt wasn't hers, but she wore it anyway. Every family photo, every "you have your daddy's smile" comment from strangers felt like a paper cut across her heart. Across town, Megan and Colin Sullivan were in therapy. Their marriage was strained, but holding. Noah had started saying full sentences. Sometimes, when he laughed, it sounded exactly like Harold Whitman, and they didn't know what to do with that. The children, dozens of them, maybe more, were the true legacy. Perfectly healthy, beautiful, brilliant, even. Many of them already showing signs of above-average cognition, spatial reasoning, emotional regulation, but at what cost? Ramirez watched the aftermath unfold like dominoes tipped from a rooftop. She received weekly updates on new DNA matches. Case 114 Omega had grown to include 41 confirmed genetic offspring, all tied to Whitman's personal DNA. The youngest was 6 months old. The oldest was nearly 8. She attended 2 of the hearings herself. Some parents requested anonymity. Others demanded cameras. All wanted justice. On the final day of trial, Harold Whitman took the stand not to defend himself, but to speak. His voice was calm, certain. "I never forced anything," he said. "I gave life where there would have been none. These children are gifts. And one day, they will thank me. Not because I'm their father, but because I made them better." The courtroom was silent. Then Daniel Walker stood from the gallery and spoke, not shouting, but with a steady, cracking voice. "My son was never yours to improve." Judge Oakley delivered the verdict shortly after. Guilty on all counts. Harold Whitman was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Outside, under the courthouse steps, dozens of parents gathered in silence. No cheering, no closure, just quiet faces trying to understand the shape of their new reality. Some carried their children, some held hands. One held a sign that read, "Genetics don't define family, truth does." Ramirez declined interviews after the trial. She returned to her office in D.C., closed the file on case 114 Omega, and turned off the lights. But in her drawer, she kept a copy of the Genesis Protocol spreadsheet, not for evidence, not for memory, but as a reminder of how easy it is to disguise evil in white coats and warm smiles, of how trust, once broken, bleeds across generations, and of how, sometimes, monsters don't hide in shadows. They hide in answers we want to believe. It wasn't the science that failed them. It was the belief that science, in the hands of a trusted face, could never lie. What made Harold Whitman's crimes so insidious wasn't just their violation of the physical. It was how seamlessly they masqueraded as hope, how he used warmth, precision, and reverence to earn the kind of access no one ever questions, the kind granted to men in white coats and whispered reputations. He didn't steal money. He didn't forge documents. He rewrote bloodlines. And he did it with the consent of people who had no idea what they were consenting to. In the end, his legacy won't be the hundreds of lives he helped bring into the world. It will be the thousands he fractured in the process. The mothers who stare into their children's faces and wonder whose DNA they see. The fathers whose confidence in their very identity as parents was shattered. The children who may one day carry the weight of truth like a silent inheritance. Faith is powerful, but when it's placed in the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon sharper than any scalpel. And in a system that reveres credentials more than character, that mistake can go undetected for years until the truth is too large, too loud, and too late to ignore. There's a lesson buried here, somewhere in the ashes. That trust must be earned, not assumed. That transparency must be demanded, not hoped for. That ethics must evolve, just as rapidly as technology does. Because in the shadows of unchecked power, even miracles can be manipulated. And the man who claims to give life may be the one quietly stealing everything it stands for. The story of Dr. Harold Whitman is not just a criminal case. It is a profound warning about the cost of misplaced faith, a mirror held up to society's blind trust in titles, white coats, and quiet authority. Whitman didn't use force. He used hope. He preyed on the desperation of couples yearning for children and cloaked his violations in the language of healing and progress. That's what made his crimes so dangerous. They were not committed in the shadows, but in brightly lit rooms, under the guise of care, trust, and science. He believed he was improving humanity, but in doing so, he stole something deeper than DNA. He stole truth, consent, legacy, and identity from mothers, fathers, and children alike. The core lesson of this tragedy isn't found in courtrooms or medical reports. It's found in the quiet of living rooms, where parents now hold children they love, but whose genetic reality was rewritten without permission. It's found in marriages strained by betrayal, neither spouse committed. And it's found in the hearts of children who will one day grow old enough to ask, "Where did I really come from?" For the rest of us who may never enter a fertility clinic, but live in a world where institutions still command blind trust, this story is a cautionary tale. No title, degree, or reputation should go unquestioned when it comes to our bodies, our rights, or our children. We must learn to ask harder questions, to demand transparency, not simply assume virtue, to believe that consent isn't a checkbox, it's a living, breathing conversation that never ends. In an age of advanced medicine and miraculous outcomes, we cannot afford to confuse progress with permission or success with ethics. Because when we place our faith in the wrong hands, even miracles can become crimes. And the monsters we fear don't always wear masks. Sometimes they wear stethoscopes.